I stood in my childhood bedroom suitcase, trembling in my grip, while my parents' words still burned in my ears like acid. The greatest gift I could give my golden child brother Marcus for his wedding would be to vanish from this family forever. My eyes swept across the dresser, where family photographs told the story of my entire life in painful clarity. Every single frame showcased Marcus beaming at the center while I appeared pushed to the edges, half cropped or missing entirely. My mother's voice echoed from the hallway below, discussing flower arrangements, as if nothing had happened. Without uttering a single word, I grabbed my car keys from the nightstand, walked past my shocked parents, who stood frozen by the staircase, and stepped outside into the crisp October evening. The front door closed behind me with a finality that would change everything. The engine of my old Honda Civic sputtered to life as I pulled away from the house on Maple Street, where I'd spent 28 years learning I was never quite enough. Cedar Falls, Iowa stretched out before me in the fading daylight, familiar streets blurring past as I drove without destination or purpose. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, memories flooding back like a dam had burst in my mind. I remembered the Christmas when I was 12 and Marcus was 10. He'd unwrapped a brand new mountain bike with 21 speeds and metallic blue paint that gleamed under the tree lights. My gift sat in the corner wrapped in yesterday's newspaper because we'd run out of proper wrapping paper. Inside was Marcus's old bicycle from 3 years earlier, hastily repainted with rust still showing through the cheap spray paint. When I tried to hide my disappointment, my father, Richard, clapped me on the shoulder and said I should be grateful for hand-me-downs because they built character. The pattern continued through high school. Marcus brought home report cards with mostly C's and the occasional B-, and our mother Dorothy would paste them on the refrigerator with star stickers and take him out for ice cream. My honor roll certificates earned semester after semester with straight A's and perfect attendance would get filed away in a drawer without ceremony. When I graduated as valedictorian, my parents missed the ceremony because Marcus had a baseball game that same afternoon. He played right field and spent most innings picking dandelions. College was where the disparity became impossible to ignore. Marcus received a full ride to the state university, not because of academic merit or athletic scholarship, but because my parents liquidated their retirement savings and took out a second mortgage on the house. They called it an investment in his future. When I applied to schools, I was told the family budget was stretched too thin for another college fund. I worked 3 jobs throughout my senior year, saving every penny for tuition at the local community college before transferring to finish my engineering degree at Iowa State. The consulting business I built after graduation grew from nothing into something I could be proud of. Small manufacturers throughout the Midwest hired me to optimize their production processes and reduce waste. I lived modestly in a 1-bedroom apartment downtown, driving the same reliable Honda and cooking most of my meals at home. Every dollar saved went back into the business or emergency funds habits learned from years of financial uncertainty. 3 months ago, Marcus announced his engagement to Sarah Patterson, his college sweetheart, whose family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. Within hours of the announcement, my mother had transformed into a wedding planning tornado, discussing venues that cost more than most people's annual salaries and guest lists that read like the social register of Cedar Falls. When she mentioned the total budget would approach $50,000, I offered to contribute from my business savings. The silence that followed my offer stretched uncomfortably long. Then, my father started laughing, a sound devoid of warmth or affection. He looked at my mother and said loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, "Can you believe that we don't need charity from the backup, son?" Other diners turned to stare, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. Marcus studied his menu intently, saying nothing in my defense. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat, jolting me back to the present moment. 17 missed calls, all from Marcus. The display showed another incoming call from him now. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the parking lot of a Sinclair gas station and answered. Fred, thank God you picked up. Marcus's voice was thick with tears, something I hadn't heard since we were children. Where you mom and dad are freaking out because you just left without saying anything. What did you expect me to say after what they told me? I kept my voice steady, despite the anger boiling in my chest. That's what I'm calling about. His words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing this conversation. I never wanted you excluded from the wedding. I swear on Sarah's life I had no idea they were planning to say that to you. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What do you mean you had no idea? They came to me last week and said. He paused, taking a shaky breath. They said the wedding would be more elegant and meaningful if it was just immediate family. They told me you'd understand because you've always been the practical one who puts family needs first. But then tonight after you left, Mom let it slip what they actually said to you. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. They made the decision without asking you. Worse than that, Fred. They threatened me. Said if I insisted on inviting you, they'd cut off all financial support for the wedding and disown me completely. You know Sarah's parents are already contributing half the costs, and I can't ask them to cover everything. My job at the insurance office barely covers rent, let alone a wedding. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest. 28 years of manipulation suddenly made perfect sense. Our parents hadn't just favored Marcus randomly. They'd systematically pitted us against each other while keeping us both under their control. Marcus got the privileges and financial support that made him dependent on their approval, while I got the cold shoulder that kept me hungry for their validation. I'm sorry, Fred. I should have stood up to them years ago, but I was scared of losing everything. The wedding, Sarah, the life we planned together. I know that makes me a coward. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This was the first real conversation we'd had since childhood, before the competition and favoritism created an unbridgeable divide between us. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. How many times over the years have Mom and Dad told you I didn't want to be involved in family events? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he whispered, almost every time. They said you were too busy with work or that you felt uncomfortable at family gatherings because you'd gotten too big for your britches. My hands started shaking. I never said any of that. I've been waiting for invitations that never came. I drove to my apartment in a daze, Marcus's revelation echoing in my mind like a bell that couldn't stop ringing. The small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a converted Victorian house had been my sanctuary for 5 years, furnished with second-hand finds and thrift store treasures that I'd slowly upgraded as my business grew. Tonight it felt like a crime scene where I needed to gather evidence of my own life. The cardboard boxes stacked in my bedroom closet contained everything I'd salvaged from our grandmother's estate sale 2 years ago. While my parents and Marcus had focused on claiming the valuable antiques and jewelry, I'd quietly rescued the family documents, photo albums, and personal papers that everyone else considered junk. Grandmother Helen had been a meticulous record keeper, saving everything from school report cards to medical bills in carefully labeled manila envelopes. I spread the contents across my kitchen table under the bright overhead light, organizing everything chronologically. What emerged was a pattern so deliberate and systematic that it took my breath away. The report cards told the first part of the story. Elementary school through high school, my grades consistently outperformed Marcus by significant margins. 3rd grade, Fred A average, Marcus C plus average. 7th grade, Fred honor roll all 4 quarters. Marcus passing, with remedial help in math and science. Senior year, Fred ranked 3rd in a class of 215 students, Marcus graduating in the bottom half with a 2.1 grade point average. But my mother's diary entries, written in her careful cursive handwriting, painted a completely different narrative. Marcus is such a bright boy, always thinking outside the box. His teachers don't appreciate his creative approach to learning. Fred gets good grades, but he lacks Marcus's natural charisma and leadership potential. Worried that Fred's academic success is making Marcus feel inadequate. Need to make sure both boys feel valued for their unique gifts. The medical records revealed an even more disturbing pattern. When Marcus broke his wrist playing baseball at 14, he received immediate care at the private orthopedic clinic, followed by 6 weeks of physical therapy and a custom brace that cost $800. When I dislocated my shoulder in a bicycle accident at 16, I was told to tough it out for 3 days before being taken to the emergency room at the county hospital. The bill marked "paid in full by patient" was in my own handwriting. I'd worked double shifts at the grocery store for 2 months to cover the cost. The college documents made my hands shake with anger. Buried beneath Marcus's acceptance letters and scholarship applications was an envelope I'd never seen before addressed to me from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The postmark was dated 8 years ago, just weeks before high school graduation. Inside was a full academic scholarship offer worth over $200,000, complete with work-study opportunities and research assistantships that would have launched my engineering career into the stratosphere. The letter had been opened and read, then carefully resealed. A sticky note in my mother's handwriting was attached to the back. Fred doesn't need to know about this. MIT would take him too far from family, and Marcus needs him here to help with the family business we're planning to start. The family business that never materialized. The excuse they used to keep me local while secretly ensuring I'd struggle financially and remain dependent on their approval. Meanwhile, Marcus got a free ride to the state university and 4 years to explore his options without pressure or expectations. But the most shocking discovery waited in the final envelope marked "Legal Documents Important." Inside was a copy of our Uncle George's last will and testament, dated just 6 months before his death 5 years ago. Uncle George had been the successful one in the family, turning a single hardware store into a regional chain before dying suddenly of a heart attack at 62. The will was crystal clear in its language and intent. To my nephew Frederick Thomas, who has always demonstrated responsibility, integrity, and independence. I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to $800,000 in liquid assets, the Lake House property in Brainerd, Minnesota, and controlling interest in all George's hardware locations. I read the words 3 times before they sank in. Uncle George had left me everything. His entire fortune built over decades of hard work and smart business decisions. The lake house where I'd spent magical summer weeks as a child, learning to fish and helping with inventory at the original store. The business that could have provided financial security for the rest of my life. But I'd never received a penny. I'd never even known about the inheritance. Attached to the will was a document I'd supposedly signed declining the inheritance and transferring all assets to Marcus instead. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but the more I studied it, the more convinced I became that it was forged. The F in Frederick was too bold, the loop in the G too small. Someone had copied my signature carefully, but not perfectly. My phone rang, startling me out of my investigation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a Minnesota area code. "Is this Frederick Thomas?" The woman's voice was professional but warm with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes, who's asking?" "My name is Amanda Rodriguez. I'm an attorney in Minneapolis, and I've been trying to reach you for over 5 years regarding your Uncle George's estate." The room started spinning. "I think there's been some mistake. My uncle left everything to my brother Marcus. Mr. Thomas, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your Uncle George specifically named you as his sole beneficiary. I've been attempting to contact you since his death. But every letter I sent was returned as undeliverable, and every phone number I had for you was disconnected. Your parents told me you'd moved out of state and wanted no contact with the family. My legs gave out and I sank into the kitchen chair. My parents told you what? According to your father, you'd signed papers declining the inheritance and had specifically requested that all assets be transferred to your brother instead. He provided documentation that appeared to be in order, so we processed the transfer. But something about the situation never felt right to me. The signature was forged. I whispered the words barely audible. I suspected as much, which is why I've continued investigating. Mr. Thomas, if you're willing to meet with me, I believe we have grounds for a fraud case that could restore your rightful inheritance. Amanda Rodriguez's law office occupied the top floor of a glass building overlooking downtown Minneapolis, with a view of the Mississippi River that reminded me why I'd always loved visiting Uncle George's lake house. The attorney herself was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and a confidence that immediately put me at ease. I've been building this case for 5 years, she said, spreading documents across the polished conference table between us. Your Uncle George was my client for over a decade, and he spoke about you frequently. He was convinced you had the business acumen and integrity to take his company to the next level. The file she opened was thick with correspondence, financial records, and legal documents that painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple favoritism. Amanda had tried to contact me 17 different times through multiple channels, including certified mail phone calls and even a private investigator who'd been turned away at my parents' door. Your father was very convincing, Amanda explained, sliding a stack of letters across the table. He claimed you'd become estranged from the family after college, moved to Seattle for work, and wanted nothing to do with your Iowa roots. He said you'd specifically instructed him to handle any legal matters on your behalf. The letters were all addressed to me at my parents' house, marked "Return to Sender" in my father's handwriting. Each envelope contained urgent legal documents requiring my attention, offers to meet and discuss the inheritance, and increasingly concerned inquiries about my whereabouts and well-being. Here's where it gets interesting. Amanda continued pulling out a folder marked "Financial Records." Your brother Marcus began accessing the inheritance funds immediately after the transfer was completed. $800,000 disappeared over 4 years through a series of transactions that suggest your parents were controlling the spending. The bank statements told a story of spectacular financial irresponsibility. Luxury car purchases, expensive vacations to Europe and the Caribbean Country Club memberships, and regular cash withdrawals that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus's name was on the account, but the spending patterns matched my parents' lifestyle perfectly. They were living like millionaires on your money, Amanda said bluntly. The lake house has been used as collateral for multiple loans, and the hardware store chain has been systematically stripped of its assets. 3 of the 5 locations have already been sold to cover debts. I felt physically sick looking at the evidence. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to build my consulting business and living paycheck to paycheck, my family had been funding a lifestyle of luxury, using money that rightfully belonged to me. There's more, Amanda said gently, recognizing my distress. I hired a private investigator to track down other family members who might have information about your whereabouts. What we discovered suggests a pattern of isolation that goes back years. She handed me a list of names and phone numbers that made my heart race. Cousin Jennifer in California, whom I remembered as my closest childhood friend during family reunions. Aunt Patricia in Texas. Uncle George's sister, who'd always sent me birthday cards until they mysteriously stopped arriving. Cousin David in Florida, who'd invited me to be his best man at a wedding I never knew about. Every one of these family members tried to maintain contact with you over the years, Amanda explained. Your cousin Jennifer sent wedding invitations, birth announcements for her children, and Christmas cards. Your Aunt Patricia called multiple times, asking why you'd stopped responding to her letters. They all received the same story from your parents. Fred had requested no contact with extended family and wanted to focus on his career. The isolation had been complete and calculated. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They'd systematically cut me off from every family member who might have provided emotional support or alternative perspectives on their behavior. They'd created a bubble where their version of reality was the only truth I ever heard. "I have recordings," Amanda said, lowering her voice. "Your cousin Jennifer became suspicious about 3 years ago and started documenting her conversations with your parents. With her permission, I'd like you to hear one of them." She pressed play on a small digital recorder. My cousin Jennifer's voice came through clearly warm and concerned in a way that brought tears to my eyes. "Dorothy, I'm worried about Fred. I haven't heard from him since Uncle George's funeral, and that's not like him. We used to talk all the time." My mother's response was smooth and practiced. "Oh, Jennifer, I'm sorry we didn't tell you sooner. Fred's been going through a difficult time. He's become very antisocial and specifically asked us not to give his contact information to anyone in the family. He says he needs space to work through some personal issues." That doesn't sound like the Fred I know. He was always so family-oriented. People change, honey. Success went to his head a bit, and he's decided he's outgrown his small-town roots. We respect his decision, but it's been hard on all of us. The lies flowed so effortlessly that I wondered how many years my mother had been perfecting this narrative. She'd painted me as the villain in my own story, the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his loving family for selfish ambitions. Your cousin Jennifer never believed the story. Amanda continued after stopping the recording. She kept trying different approaches to reach you, including hiring her own private investigator last year. That's how she found my office and learned about the inheritance fraud. My hands were shaking as I processed the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. Not just money and property, but relationships with people who genuinely cared about me. Years of birthday wishes, holiday celebrations, and life milestones that I'd missed because my parents needed to maintain their web of lies. "What are our options?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We have several avenues for legal action," Amanda replied, her professional demeanor returning. "Inheritance fraud, identity theft, forgery, and potentially racketeering if we can prove conspiracy. But before we proceed, there's something else you need to know." She pulled out one final document, this one bearing the letterhead of Patterson Automotive Group. "Your brother's future father-in-law, Henry Patterson, is a client of mine for his business legal needs. He's been conducting financial background checks on Marcus and your family as part of standard due diligence for the wedding." My stomach dropped. "He knows about the fraud. He suspects something significant, but he doesn't have all the details yet. Henry's a shrewd businessman who built his dealership empire from nothing. He recognizes the signs of financial deception, and he's been quietly investigating your family's assets and spending patterns." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus's wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was potentially the last piece of my parents' long-term strategy. Marry Marcus into the Patterson family's wealth, secure their financial future, and complete the erasure of my rightful place in the family inheritance. "Mr. Thomas," Amanda said, leaning forward with intensity, "I need you to understand something. Your parents aren't just thieves. They're sociopaths who've spent years systematically destroying your relationships and opportunities. This isn't about money anymore. It's about justice." The drive back to Cedar Falls felt like traveling through a time warp, where every mile brought back memories that now carried completely different meanings. The hardware store, where Uncle George had taught me to mix paint and calculate lumber measurements, wasn't just a nostalgic childhood memory. It was part of an inheritance that had been stolen from me. The lake house where I'd spent magical summer weeks learning to fish and helping with inventory wasn't just a fond recollection. It was property that rightfully belonged to me. Amanda followed in her own car, a sleek silver BMW that announced her professional success, in a way my old Honda never could. In her briefcase were copies of every document we'd need to confront my parents with the truth. The forged signatures, the fraudulent transfer documents, the hidden correspondence, and the financial records showing exactly how my inheritance had been spent. The sun was setting as we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home on Maple Street. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd stormed out 2 days earlier, but everything else had changed. Through the living room window, I could see my parents moving frantically around the house, my mother pacing while talking rapidly on her phone, and my father hunched over a laptop with papers scattered across the dining room table. Even from outside, the chaos was visible. Wedding vendors' trucks were conspicuously absent from the driveway, where they should have been delivering flowers, linens, and catering supplies. Instead, my father's aging Buick sat next to my mother's 10-year-old Mercedes, both cars that I now realized had been purchased with my stolen inheritance money. I rang the doorbell rather than using my key, a small gesture that signaled this wasn't a family visit, but a formal confrontation. My mother opened the door with her phone still pressed to her ear, clearly expecting a vendor or wedding planner. Her face went pale when she saw me standing next to a professional-looking woman carrying a leather briefcase. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone, ending her conversation abruptly. "Fred's sweetheart, you came home. We were so worried about you." The false warmth in her voice was so practiced that I wondered how many years she'd been perfecting that tone of maternal concern. Behind her, my father appeared in the hallway, his face showing a mixture of relief and apprehension that confirmed he knew exactly why I was there. "Mom, Dad, this is Amanda Rodriguez. She's an attorney from Minneapolis, and she needs to speak with you about Uncle George's estate." The color drained from my father's face so quickly, I thought he might collapse. My mother's mask of concern cracked, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I don't understand," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What does Uncle George's estate have to do with anything that was all settled years ago?" Amanda stepped forward with professional composure. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, I represent your son Frederick in a case involving inheritance fraud, identity theft, and forgery. I think it would be best if we discuss this matter privately." We followed my parents into the living room where the evidence of their current crisis was impossible to hide. Wedding planning documents covered every surface, many marked with red stamps reading "Payment Overdue" and "Final Notice." Multiple cell phones buzzed constantly with incoming calls that my parents ignored. The elaborate wedding they'd promised Sarah's family was clearly falling apart. "Where's Marcus?" I asked, noting his absence from what should have been a busy evening of wedding preparations. "He's at Sarah's family's house," my mother said, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "They're having a rehearsal dinner with just the immediate families." The irony wasn't lost on me. Even at his own rehearsal dinner, Marcus was trapped in the web of lies my parents had created. He was probably making excuses for why his brother wasn't there, unaware that his entire engagement was built on stolen money. Amanda opened her briefcase and began laying documents on the coffee table with methodical precision. Bank statements, legal correspondence, and financial records created a paper trail that told the complete story of 5 years of systematic fraud. "Let's start with the basics," Amanda said, her voice professionally neutral. "Mr. Thomas, do you recall signing these documents transferring Frederick's inheritance to Marcus?" My father picked up the papers with trembling hands, studying the forged signature that I now recognized as an imperfect copy of my handwriting. The silence stretched uncomfortably long as he realized there was no plausible explanation for what he was looking at. "Richard, don't say anything," my mother warned, her voice sharp with panic. "We need to call our attorney." "Your attorney won't help you with this," Amanda replied calmly. "The evidence is overwhelming, and we have testimony from multiple family members who were deceived about Frederick's whereabouts and intentions." My father set the papers down and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red with tears I'd never seen him shed before. "We never meant for it to go this far," he whispered. "It started small, just borrowing against the inheritance to cover some temporary cash flow problems. We were going to pay it back before Fred ever knew about it." "Richard, stop talking," my mother hissed, but he continued as if he hadn't heard her. "The business was failing. The auto parts store we'd invested everything in went under when the economy crashed. We were facing bankruptcy, losing the house, losing everything we'd worked for our entire lives. The confession came pouring out like water from a broken dam. Years of financial mismanagement and poor investment decisions had left my parents drowning in debt just as Uncle George's inheritance became available. What started as temporary borrowing had escalated into systematic theft when they realized no one was monitoring the account. We told ourselves that Marcus deserved the money anyway. My father continued, his voice breaking. He'd always been the one who needed more support, more guidance. Fred was so independent and successful with his business, we convinced ourselves he didn't need Uncle George's money. My mother finally spoke, her voice cold and calculating, in a way that chilled me to the bone. Fred always made us feel like failures. Everything came so easily to him, grades and work and that consulting business. Marcus needed our help to succeed, but Fred acted like he was too good for this family. The twisted logic of her justification was breathtaking. They'd stolen from me because my independence and success made them feel inadequate, then used that same independence to justify why I didn't deserve what was rightfully mine. You isolated me from the entire extended family, Ma, I said, finding my voice for the first time since we'd entered the house. You intercepted letters, blocked phone calls, and lied to everyone who tried to maintain a relationship with me. We were protecting you, my mother replied, but her words sounded hollow even to her. Those people only cared about you because of George's money. They would have used you. Amanda interjected with facts that cut through my mother's rationalizations like a knife through tissue paper. Mrs. Thomas, we have recorded conversations where you told multiple family members that Frederick had requested no contact. We have documentation showing that you returned legal correspondence without his knowledge. There's no way to characterize these actions as protection. The room fell silent except for the constant buzzing of ignored phone calls and the distant sound of traffic on Maple Street. Outside neighbors were probably preparing for normal Friday evening activities, unaware that a family was disintegrating in the house with the perfectly maintained lawn and cheerful yellow shutters. My father looked up at me with an expression of defeat that was almost pitiful. The wedding costs got out of control. Sarah's family expects a certain level of elegance, and we'd already promised Marcus that money would be no object. When the vendors started demanding payment up front, we had to use the last of the inheritance funds. You spent $800,000 on a wedding. I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Not just the wedding. My mother admitted, her composure finally cracking completely. The country club memberships, the cars, the vacation to Italy last summer. We were trying to maintain appearances so Marcus could attract a wife from a successful family. The strategy was as pathetic as it was criminal. They'd stolen my inheritance to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford, hoping to marry Marcus into wealth that would solve their financial problems permanently. Meanwhile, I'd been working multiple jobs and living in a modest apartment, completely unaware that I was entitled to financial security that would have changed everything. There's something else you need to know, Amanda said, consulting her notes. Sarah's father, Henry Patterson, has been conducting his own investigation into your family's finances. He's discovered irregularities that have made him question whether to proceed with the wedding. My parents exchanged a look of pure terror. The elaborate plan they'd spent years executing was collapsing around them, and there was no way to salvage the situation through more lies and manipulation. What do you want from us? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my parents, these people who'd shaped my entire understanding of my worth and place in the world through decades of calculated emotional abuse and financial theft. For the first time in my life, I held all the cards. Before I could respond to my mother's question, the front door burst open and Marcus stumbled into the living room, his face flushed with panic and his wedding tuxedo disheveled from what appeared to be a hasty escape. Behind him came Sarah Patterson, still wearing her rehearsal dinner dress, but with tears streaming down her cheeks, followed by an older man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of authority that comes from building an empire from nothing. "Dad, what the hell is happening?" Marcus demanded, taking in the scene of scattered legal documents and his parents' obvious distress. "Sarah's father just accused our family of fraud at the rehearsal dinner. He said there are questions about Uncle George's inheritance and that the wedding might need to be postponed." Henry Patterson stepped forward, extending his hand to Amanda with professional courtesy. "Ms. Rodriguez, I presume? We spoke on the phone this afternoon about coordinating our investigations." The pieces of a much larger puzzle began clicking into place. While I'd been discovering the truth about my stolen inheritance, Sarah's father had been conducting his own due diligence investigation into the family his daughter was joining. As a successful businessman who'd built Patterson Automotive Group from a single used car lot into a regional empire, Henry Patterson had developed an eye for financial deception. Mr. Patterson has been very helpful in providing additional documentation. Amanda explained, pulling out a new folder from her briefcase. His investigation uncovered spending patterns and asset transfers that corroborate our fraud case. Sarah looked between Marcus and her father with confusion and growing horror. "Daddy, what kind of investigation?" "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Henry Patterson's voice was measured but firm as he addressed the room. "Sarah, sweetheart, when a family joins through marriage, their financial obligations become intertwined. I always conduct background checks to ensure there are no hidden debts or legal liabilities that could affect our family's interests." He turned to face my parents with the intensity of a predator who'd cornered his prey. What I discovered was a pattern of fraudulent spending funded by an inheritance that was illegally transferred from Frederick to Marcus without Frederick's knowledge or consent. Marcus staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. "What do you mean illegally transferred? Uncle George left everything to me." "No, he didn't," I said quietly, watching my brother's world crumble in real time. "Uncle George left everything to me. Mom and Dad forged my signature and told everyone I'd moved away and didn't want contact with the family." The silence that followed was broken only by Sarah's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of my father's phone buzzing with another ignored call from a wedding vendor. $800,000. Henry Patterson continued relentlessly. "A lake house in Minnesota, controlling interest in a successful hardware store chain, all stolen through documented fraud, and every penny has been spent maintaining a lifestyle your family couldn't afford." Marcus turned to our parents with an expression of betrayal that mirrored my own feelings perfectly. "You lied to me about everything. You made me complicit in stealing from my own brother." "We were protecting our family," my mother said weakly, but her words carried no conviction anymore. "You were protecting yourselves," Sarah said, her voice cold with disgust. "You stole money to pay for a wedding you couldn't afford so you could trick my family into supporting you financially." Henry Patterson nodded approvingly at his daughter's quick grasp of the situation. "Exactly right, sweetheart. This entire engagement appears to have been orchestrated as a financial rescue plan." Amanda seized the moment to present the legal options with clinical precision. "We can pursue criminal charges for inheritance fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The penalties include significant jail time and full financial restitution, which, given the spent assets, would likely require liquidation of all family property. My parents' house, the cars, their retirement accounts, everything would have to be sold to begin repaying what they'd stolen from me. They would face public humiliation, criminal prosecution, and financial ruin that would follow them for the rest of their lives. However," Amanda continued, "my client is willing to consider alternative arrangements if full restitution can be made and certain conditions are met." All eyes turned to me as I realized I held the power to determine not just my own future, but the fate of everyone in the room. The scared, desperate people sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the confident parents who'd shaped my childhood through emotional manipulation and favoritism. "I want everything returned," I said, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it before. The inheritance, the lake house, the business interests, all of it. You'll sign legal documents admitting to the fraud and relinquishing any claim to Uncle George's estate. My father nodded eagerly, relief flooding his features at the possibility of avoiding criminal prosecution. I'm not finished, I continued. You'll also contact every family member you lied to over the years and admit what you did. Cousin Jennifer, Aunt Patricia, everyone you told that I didn't want contact with them. My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her, but she didn't protest. And one more thing, I said, looking directly at Marcus. You'll tell the truth about everything at your wedding tomorrow. No more lies, no more cover stories, no more manipulation. But Henry Patterson was already shaking his head before I finished speaking. I'm afraid there won't be a wedding tomorrow, Frederick. Not after what we've learned tonight. The devastating finality of his words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah reached for his hand, but he pulled away, overwhelmed by shame and betrayal. Daddy, please, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Marcus didn't know about any of this. He's as much a victim as Frederick. Perhaps. Henry replied, his tone softening slightly when he looked at his daughter. But trust is the foundation of any partnership, business or personal. How can we build a life together when the entire relationship began with deception? The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had received everything throughout our lives, the love, attention, and financial support that should have been shared equally between us. But in the end, his dependence on our parents' manipulation had cost him the one thing that mattered most to him. Amanda's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and smiled slightly. That's your cousin Jennifer calling back. She's been coordinating with your other relatives since I contacted her this afternoon. They're all eager to reconnect with you, Frederick. For the first time in days, I felt something resembling hope. Somewhere beyond the wreckage of my immediate family, there were people who genuinely cared about me and had been actively trying to maintain relationships that my parents had systematically destroyed. There's one more thing, Henry Patterson said, his attention turning to me with an appraising look. My investigation into your consulting business was quite impressive, Frederick. Your client references describe work that saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational efficiency. I wasn't sure where he was leading, but his tone suggested this wasn't casual conversation. Patterson Automotive Group is expanding into fleet management and logistics consulting. We could use someone with your analytical skills and engineering background. The starting salary would be $200,000 annually with performance bonuses and profit sharing. The job offer was so unexpected and generous that I thought I'd misheard him. In one evening, I'd gone from having my inheritance stolen to being offered a position that would provide financial security beyond anything I'd imagined. Think about it, Henry continued, but not tonight. Tonight we need to focus on cleaning up this mess and figuring out how to move forward. Saturday morning arrived with the surreal quality of a fever dream. The day that should have been Marcus and Sarah's wedding instead dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was mourning the collapse of carefully laid plans. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, having spent the night in the house where I'd grown up, learning that I was never quite enough, but this time holding legal documents that proved I'd always been worth more than my parents had allowed me to believe. The phone calls had started at sunrise. Wedding vendors demanding immediate payment, guests calling to confirm details that no longer existed, and Sarah's extended family trying to understand why the celebration they'd traveled from 3 states to attend had been abruptly canceled. My parents had spent the night making one devastating phone call after another, explaining to friends and relatives that the wedding was off due to unexpected family circumstances. Amanda arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a notary public and carrying documents that would legally restore my rightful inheritance. The papers were spread across the dining room table, where my family had shared thousands of meals together, but the atmosphere now felt more like a business transaction than a family gathering. Marcus sat across from me, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled dress shirt, his eyes red from a sleepless night spent confronting the reality that his entire adult life had been built on stolen money. Sarah had returned to her parents' house after the confrontation, leaving Marcus to face the consequences of our family's deception alone. "I need you to understand something," Marcus said as our parents signed document after document, transferring property and assets back to my name. "I really didn't know about Uncle George's will. I thought he'd chosen me as his heir because you were always so independent and successful. I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of the manipulation and entitlement that had characterized our relationship for decades. Instead, I saw genuine remorse and a vulnerability that reminded me of the little boy who used to follow me around the neighborhood, desperate for attention and approval from anyone who would provide it. Our parents spent years making both of us believe lies about each other," I replied. "You thought I didn't want to be part of the family, and I thought you were the golden child who could do no wrong. We were both victims of their manipulation." The legal paperwork took 3 hours to complete, with Amanda ensuring that every asset was properly transferred and every fraudulent transaction was documented for potential future prosecution. The lake house in Minnesota, the remaining hardware store locations, and what little remained of the original $800,000 were all restored to my name. But the most important document was the one my parents signed admitting to their fraud and absolving Marcus of any criminal liability. My brother had been an unknowing beneficiary of stolen money, not a willing participant in the theft. The legal distinction would protect him from prosecution, though it couldn't restore the wedding that had crumbled under the weight of our family's deception. "What happens now?" my mother asked as Amanda packed the signed documents into her briefcase. For the first time in my life, my mother looked old, and defeated her carefully maintained facade of maternal authority, cracking to reveal someone who was scared and vulnerable. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," Amanda replied matter-of-factly. "Frederick has chosen not to pursue criminal charges in exchange for full restitution. But that doesn't eliminate the civil penalties or public consequences of what you've done." The house on Maple Street would have to be sold to cover debts that had accumulated over years of living beyond their means. The cars purchased with my stolen inheritance would be repossessed. My parents faced bankruptcy, public humiliation, and the destruction of relationships they'd spent decades building on false pretenses. But even in their defeat, there was an opportunity for redemption that hadn't existed before the truth was revealed. "I have a proposal," I said, looking at both of my parents directly. "You can choose to see this as the end of everything or as a chance to start over and build real relationships based on honesty instead of manipulation." My father looked up with the first spark of hope I'd seen in his eyes since the confrontation began. "The lake house needs caretakers," I continued. "Uncle George always hired a local couple to maintain the property during the off-season and manage rentals during the summer. The job comes with a small house on the property and a modest salary, nothing luxurious but enough to live comfortably." The offer was more generous than my parents deserved, but it represented something more important than punishment or revenge. It was an opportunity for them to contribute something meaningful while taking responsibility for their actions. "Why would you offer us that after everything we've done?" My mother asked, confusion, replacing the defensive anger that had characterized her responses the night before. "Because holding on to anger will poison my life more than yours," I replied. "And because Marcus is still my brother, regardless of what our parents did to pit us against each other." Speaking of Marcus, he'd been unusually quiet during the legal proceedings, staring out the window at the empty driveway where wedding vendors' trucks should have been arriving with flowers and catering supplies. "Sarah's not taking my calls," he said quietly. "Her father thinks I was complicit in the fraud, and she doesn't know what to believe anymore." The pain in his voice was genuine, and for the first time in years, I felt sympathy for my brother, rather than resentment. His dependence on our parents' financial support had made him a puppet in their schemes, but it had also cost him the relationship that mattered most to him. "Give her time," I said. If she really loves you, she'll be able to separate you from what our parents did. But you'll have to prove that you can build a life based on your own efforts, not on inherited money or family connections. Amanda's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jennifer in California. Over the past 24 hours, word had spread through the extended family about my parents' deception and the restoration of Uncle George's inheritance. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out to reconnect and express their support. Your cousin Jennifer wants to organize a family reunion at the lake house this summer, Amanda said after ending the call. She's been planning it for years but couldn't invite you because your parents claimed you wanted no contact with the family. The idea of spending a weekend at the lake house with relatives who actually wanted my company felt like a dream too good to be true. For years, I'd assumed that my extended family's silence meant they'd moved on without me, when in reality, they'd been prevented from maintaining relationships by my parents' systematic deception. There's something else. Amanda continued consulting her notes. Henry Patterson called this morning. He wants to meet with you next week to discuss that job offer, but he also had a message for Marcus. Marcus looked up from his brooding with surprise. He said that Sarah spent the night talking to her mother about everything that happened, and she specifically asked her father not to close the door on your relationship permanently. She needs time to process what she learned, but she doesn't blame you for your parents' actions. The relief on Marcus's face was visible, though it was tempered by the reality that rebuilding trust would require significant effort and complete honesty going forward. Mr. Patterson also said something else, Amanda added with a slight smile. He's offered to pay for a small private wedding ceremony for you and Sarah if you still want to get married. Nothing elaborate, just immediate family and close friends, but his way of showing that he doesn't hold you responsible for your parents' crimes. The generosity of the offer was staggering, especially given that Henry Patterson had every reason to protect his family from further association with ours. But it also represented something more important, the possibility of redemption through honest relationships and genuine effort. There's a condition, Amanda continued. The ceremony would be held at Frederick's Lake House, and both families would participate as equals. No hierarchy, no favoritism, just two people getting married with the support of people who care about them. I looked at Marcus, this brother who'd been shaped by the same parents' manipulation, but from the opposite direction, and realized that we both had the opportunity to break free from patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. I'd be honored to host your wedding at the lake house, I said, but only if you're ready to build a marriage based on who you really are, not on the version of yourself our parents created. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of Uncle George's lake house, watching Marcus teach Sarah how to cast a fishing line into the clear waters of Lake Brainerd. The technique he was demonstrating was one I'd taught him during a rare moment of genuine connection when we were kids before the competition, and favoritism had created an unbridgeable divide between us. Now, watching him patiently guide Sarah's arm through the proper motion, I could see glimpses of the brother I'd lost somewhere along the way. The transformation in all of our lives had been profound and sometimes painful. My parents had indeed taken the caretaking position at the lake house, trading their suburban pretensions for honest work, maintaining the property and managing vacation rentals. The arrangement wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when old patterns of manipulation surfaced, but the accountability of living on my property and earning their keep had forced them to confront decades of self-deception. My mother had struggled the most with the adjustment, mourning the loss of social status and luxury that had defined her identity for so long. But gradually, as she spent days cleaning rental cabins and tending to the small garden behind the caretaker's house, something genuine began emerging from beneath the artificial facade she'd maintained for years. She'd even started calling me weekly, not to ask for money or favors, but simply to share updates about the wildlife she'd spotted around the lake, or the improvements she was making to the landscaping. My father had thrown himself into the physical work of property maintenance with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Years of sedentary office work and country club leisure had left him soft and disconnected from the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Now, whether he was repairing dock planks or clearing hiking trails, he seemed to have found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his previous lifestyle. Marcus and Sarah had indeed married in a small ceremony held right here on the lake house deck, with fairy lights strung between the pine trees and wildflowers gathered from the meadow serving as centerpieces. Henry Patterson had walked Sarah down the makeshift aisle, while I stood as Marcus's best man, a role I'd never imagined fulfilling given our complicated history. The wedding had been simple and genuine in a way that the elaborate celebration my parents had planned never could have been. More importantly, Marcus had spent the months since our family's crisis building a life based on his own efforts rather than inherited advantages. He'd taken a job with a local insurance company starting at the bottom and working his own way up through demonstrated competence rather than family connections. Sarah had stood by him through the transition, proving that her feelings were based on who he was as a person rather than the financial security his family name had promised. My own life had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The consulting business I'd built from nothing had expanded exponentially after Henry Patterson's investment and partnership. Patterson Logistics, our joint venture combining automotive fleet management with industrial efficiency consulting, was now serving clients across the Midwest and generating revenue that exceeded my wildest projections. But the financial success was less important than the relationships that had been restored and rebuilt. Cousin Jennifer had become one of my closest confidants, calling regularly from California to share updates about her children and seek advice about her own business ventures. Aunt Patricia had visited twice from Texas, bringing photo albums that filled in years of family history I'd missed, and stories about Uncle George's pride in my academic and professional achievements. The extended family reunion that had been planned for this summer had exceeded everyone's expectations. Nearly 30 relatives had gathered at the lake house for a week of fishing, swimming, and shared meals that felt like reclaiming something precious that had been lost for years. During those conversations, I'd learned that Uncle George had talked about me constantly in the years before his death, expressing confidence that I had the character and intelligence to continue building his legacy in ways that would benefit everyone. The hardware store chain, now fully restored to my ownership, had become a testing ground for innovative retail approaches that combined traditional customer service with modern efficiency systems. 3 of the original 5 locations were not only operational again, but showing profit margins that exceeded their historical performance. The business was thriving under management that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term extraction. Amanda Rodriguez had become more than just my attorney. She'd become a trusted advisor whose guidance had been essential in navigating the complex legal and emotional aftermath of my family's deception. Her thoroughness and integrity had not only restored my stolen inheritance, but had also helped me understand the broader patterns of manipulation that had shaped my entire understanding of my own worth. The lake house itself had become a sanctuary where healing could happen at its own pace. The guest rooms were frequently occupied by family members who'd driven hours just to spend a weekend fishing, hiking, or sitting on the deck sharing stories. The place that Uncle George had intended as my inheritance wasn't just a financial asset. It was a gathering place where authentic relationships could flourish without the artificial pressures and hidden agendas that had poisoned my childhood home. Standing here watching my brother teach his wife a skill I'd taught him 20 years ago, I was struck by the profound life lesson that had emerged from the wreckage of our family's deception. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give toxic people is your absence, not because abandonment is the goal, but because it forces them to confront the consequences of their actions while freeing you to discover who truly values you. Real family isn't determined by blood relationships or shared genetics. It's built by people who choose to support your growth rather than manipulate your vulnerabilities, who celebrate your successes rather than diminish them out of insecurity, and who offer love without conditions or hidden expectations. The relatives who'd been kept from me through my parents' lies had proven to be more genuinely supportive in 6 months than my immediate family had been in 28 years. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or excusing harmful behavior. It means releasing the emotional poison that resentment creates while maintaining appropriate boundaries that protect your well being. My parents were slowly earning back my trust through consistent, honest behavior, but that trust was based on their current actions rather than nostalgic hopes about who they might have been under different circumstances. Marcus and Sarah were laughing now as her fishing line got tangled in the overhanging branches of a pine tree. My brother was patiently working to free the hook, while Sarah covered her face in embarrassment. And their easy affection reminded me that people can change when they're given the opportunity to grow beyond the limitations that others have placed on them. My phone buzzed with a text message from my newest client, a manufacturing company in Wisconsin that had hired Patterson Logistics to optimize their supply chain operations. The project would require several site visits over the coming months, but the work was exactly the kind of complex problem solving that made me feel most alive and engaged. As the sun began setting over Lake Brainerd, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to that devastating evening 6 months ago when I'd packed my suitcase and walked away from everything I'd thought I knew about my family and my place in the world. The door that had closed behind me that night hadn't been an ending after all. It had been the beginning of discovering who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love and approval from people who'd never intended to give it freely. When you surround yourself with people who genuinely believe in your worth and potential success and happiness, don't just become possible, they multiply naturally through the encouragement and opportunities that authentic relationships provide. Tomorrow, I would drive back to Minneapolis for another week of client meetings and business development, but I'd return to the lake house next weekend for another family gathering. Jennifer's children were coming with their grandparents for their first visit to Minnesota, and Aunt Patricia was driving up from Texas with a carload of relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. The life I was building now wasn't just about recovering what had been stolen from me. It was about creating something entirely new, based on honest relationships, meaningful work, and the kind of genuine family connections that can only flourish when they're chosen rather than imposed. I walked over to join Marcus and Sarah at the water's edge, ready to help untangle the fishing line and share another small moment of connection with the brother I was slowly getting to know as the person he actually was, rather than the person our parents had shaped him to become. Have you ever discovered that people you trusted had been manipulating your relationships behind your scenes? How did you rebuild trust and create authentic connections after experiencing that kind of betrayal? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to stay updated on future stories, and sharing it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of choosing your own family. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you the courage to surround yourself with people who celebrate your authentic self rather than trying to diminish it for their own benefit.